Thanks for coming in to do an interview for the Changing Church course. In week 1, we explore the 9 principles and practices which are part of the transformational change paper that you're the author of. And that's very much a basis for the rest of the course. Tell us something of your experience and how it came to be that you gathered together the 9 principles and practices.
Well, the immediate background is the colloquium held by the Susanna Wesley Foundation about a year ago, I think.
It was.
And where a group of us, including some of those involved in this course, gathered to talk about how we understood change in the context of church. And there was a transcript of that discussion, and it fell to me to write it up. And so that's the kind of immediate background, and it reflects therefore the ideas and the experience of a range of people, not just me. But in terms of my own experience, I think it arises for me out of working for 20 years this year as a management consultant. But before that, I was ordained, I'm still ordained of course, and I had an experience as a parish priest, and I was a bishop's chaplain. These are all Church of England concepts, by the way. And it was that, actually, it was funny really, because it was my experience in working with the bishop in Guildford Diocese which got me interested in organisations and how organisations change, because we were engaged in such a process there. This is back in the 90s, so it's quite a long time ago now. And I got sufficiently interested in this that my next move was into working in organisations in management consultancy. And after a bit of a hiccup or two, I got taken on by a consulting business, mainstream, secular if you like, consulting business called Telos Partners, based in Windsor. And there I was introduced to a whole set of ideas from people like Collins and Porras, who wrote Built to Last, about what was it that enabled organisations to be sustained at a high level of performance over a long period. People like Ari de Hoos, who wrote a very similar sort of book about more about the European scene. The Tomorrow's Company Inquiry, which was again a British-based exploration of what it was that enabled companies to be successful over time and to become great companies, if you like. So I came into all of that, and I started working with organisations. I mean, and what emerged actually was that the kind of key ideas in this secular, apparently, context were actually ones that I felt quite at home with. So there was a recognition, for example, that having a very strong sense that you have a purpose as an organisation, that's great. Then that is greater than the profit motive, for example, was seen as a key driver of long-term success, and the recognition that an organisation is not a kind of just a sort of instrumental construct or a kind of technical instrument, but a community of relationships. Was an absolutely key idea to understanding how to enable such organisations to be successful over the long term. And so there was a kind of recognition, if you like, that organisations have a kind of hard dimension, products perhaps, or money, or technical jobs, or whatever it might be, and processes that go with that and all the rest of it. But actually it's also a community of people with commitments, with emotions, with loyalties, with maybe quite a high sense of motivation about what they were doing, and that one needed to see the whole picture. And I suppose that brought me into looking at a much more systemic understanding of organisations, and an interest in seeing the whole and understanding particular problems in the context of the whole. And I've been doing that with a variety of organisations, including some church-based organisations, because of my own interests and connections. We worked with a cathedral, for example, and then eventually with a religious congregation, and I'll say a bit more about that maybe later. But the impact of all that on me was to make me look back at my church experience and think, hang on, we're asking questions here it's very often, not always, but often very commercial context. which I don't think we're asking, surprising questions, if you like, about purpose, about values, about culture and so on, which we don't seem to be asking in the church, and I'm not sure why. And that got me interested in bringing these kind of more organisational, more management consultancy ideas into the church.
You use that term systemic. What do you mean by that?
Well, I guess I mean that in any organisational context, whether it's small or large, you've got a lot of different factors at play. You've got the relationships between the people involved. You've got processes which determine what the organisation does. So an obvious one would be, say, a factory where you get stuff going in at one end, you do stuff to it, it comes out at the other. You've got a kind of whole structure that you need to manage that internal process. And then you've got all those relationships with the outside world. And once you start to put all that together, that starts to get very complex when you think about the interactions within the organisation and between the organisation and the wider world, its environment. And you get a complexity about that. And you get features of the organisation's life that emerge from those interactions unplanned. Like the culture, really, usually. I mean, cultures in organisations aren't usually planned.
Yeah.
Probably be quite a good idea to do more planning, actually, in that context. But they kind of emerge from the interaction of the people. And the commitment that individuals feel to the organisation is usually an emergent thing, rather than something that you start with. Once you get beyond maybe the founders, anyway. And so you've got a whole range of things that constitute what the organisation is. Many of them not recognised in the way that organisations are formally organised. So if you look at companies, for example, especially the big ones, the listed international companies, they're owned technically by a whole set of rather anonymous pension funds or whatever they may be. But you might say that actually they're owned in the more emotional sense, because those pension funds are only really interested in short-term financial outcomes. They don't own it in any very meaningful sense other than that. And so you could say the actual ownership of the organisation lies with those people who work there. And actually maybe the people who benefit from the organisation or use the organisation, they may well feel more ownership of it.
I know a lot of models of change look at or seem to advocate that you should have predetermined outcomes, but you don't seem to agree with that from the 9 principles and practices. Can you tell us a bit about your thinking?
Well, I think the problem with predetermining outcomes or imagining that you can is actually that you really can't. No plan survives first contact with the enemy, is a well-known saying from a military context, and I think the same is true of organisational planning. I think there are two main reasons why I don't advocate being too prescriptive about the outcomes of a change process. One is that it goes back to what we've been talking about, really, that systems are too complicated, their relationships internally and externally are too complicated, the world is too complicated. We can't predict or control outcomes with the level of certainty that some thinking about strategy and about change would seem to imply. It's very difficult to say, in 5 years' time we'll be in X place, you set a target, you get there. Maybe in some contexts you can, but usually you can't. So there's something here about our limited power. But there's another, and I think it's a connected point, which is that the other problem is if you just develop a plan for change, say the leadership does it in isolation, which is often tends to do, the difficulty there is that you find you've got this marvellous kind of plan, you've got this brilliant strategy, you think, oh, wouldn't it be brilliant if the church or the organisation or whatever it is were to go there? But the problem is that not many other people agree with you when it comes to it.
Exactly.
And so you get this kind of high level of resistance from within the organisation. Now, you may think you've got power, you might think you're the chief executive or the bishop or the whatever you might be, but actually you might even formally have quite a lot of power, but you can't actually really push those plans through if people really don't want to. Or you can, but you get compliance And you need more than compliance if you're going to get a meaningful change.
Now, you talk quite a lot in the 9 principles and practices about holding together organisational insights from organisational change and spiritual practices. Can you give us an example of where you've had to do that?
I mean, I think the example that occurs to me of where there's been a really conscious effort to bring together organisational insights and a kind of spiritual insights, or a spiritual context anyway, would be the work that I did recently finished really, over 10 years or so with the Sisters of Nazareth, who are a Roman Catholic religious congregation based in 5 different regions of the world, and they run residential care homes. So they've got a significant business activity, if you like, and because they've, lots of money involved, £100 million turnover, that sort of amount of money. But they're also a religious congregation brought together before anything else for the purposes of fulfilling a religious Christian calling. And so it became evident very, very quickly, working with the sisters, that if they were going to make changes that would be effective, they faced a number of, if you like, practical, if you like, business-related problems. And there was a threat to their long-term sustainability. In fact, it was a relatively near-term threat. There were fewer sisters, they were aging, and they were coming to close houses because they didn't have the resources to keep some of them going, and they didn't have enough money. Basic stuff like that. But they have this immense sense of personal commitment, this immense sense of calling, this sense of what their charism is, that's the terminology they would use, the gift that God has given them, the calling that God has given them, the apostolate they pursue, to use all their language. And it was very, very clear that unless they believed that any changes they made to improve, if you like, the kind of practical side of their operation, unless that was consistent with their sense of who they were, of how God had, what God, it wasn't just about who they thought they are, it's about who God had called them to be. So unless there was a consistency about that, it wasn't very likely to be successful. And it wasn't very likely to feel right. So we spent a lot of time early on helping them to think about what their calling was. I mean, it wasn't that they didn't know, but what happens over time is that, or what happened over time to them, is that their sense of who they are fundamentally, or who they were fundamentally, got mixed up with a bunch of practices that had, at one point, had utility or value, it seemed right, but had become somewhat outdated. And so what we had to do was to help them to disentangle what was fundamental about who they are and what they believe God had called them to, from what they had just got used to doing, but which was no longer so relevant or so helpful. And we talked an awful lot through that process about the language we used was mission and business. And actually, I mean, a lot of the sisters, I mean, you can understand it, were very worried about the business side of it. They were very worried that we try and turn them into something that was all about money. But we kept saying to them, look, when we talk about business, we're not really talking about being more commercial. It's just a word, really, that means doing things more effectively, in a way that's more consistent with current practice. Actually, in some cases, that's more in tune with the ethical approaches to business now as well. It was just an old-fashionedness about it. And if it didn't serve that mission, we would have failed. And if it didn't enrich the mission, we'd have failed. And on the other hand, if they didn't do some of that, it was really likely that, at a practical level anyway, the mission would fail. Because there was, and I suppose what I've learned from that, and my reflection on that is, You know, for me, the world is one. I'm not a dualist, and I don't want to be a dualist. I don't want to fall into the idea that certain kinds of practice are essentially bad. You know, there is a kind of, you know, that practical doing things well in a business-like way is kind of somehow suspect, whereas spiritual ideas, doing things with a, you know, thinking of God is good in contrast. I want to say that God's in the whole. I want to say that it's God's world. And if there's some you know, wise stuff around about doing organisations well, so long as one puts that in the, you know, holds that up into the light of the gospel, if you like, into the light of what we know about God from our theology and from our faith, and it still looks pretty okay, well, then I think we'd be daft not to use it, because, you know, wisdom in the world doesn't only belong to us, to the church. It belongs, you know, God, I believe anyway, that God is at work in the wider world. The world is created and sustained by the Holy Spirit, and that's where I think the two things can come together.
Now, you talk about the making a process that is psychologically safe, honest, and that builds trust as the sort of optimum place, as it were, for transformational change. How do you go about doing that?
Well, I know that elsewhere in this course there's some conversation about theory U, which I guess is a methodology which is absolutely about creating a creative, safe space for new thought. But I'm not the theory U expert, so I won't talk about it. I'll leave that to those who are. So I'll approach it from a slightly different angle and say that I think this is an area where leadership is really important. I think we have a tendency to think that when it comes to change, that leadership's job is to come up with answers. And I've met, in my life as a consultant, I've met many people in leadership roles who think that's their job. I remember very well working with a very major, well-known police service on a strategic process, and being in a conversation in which a very senior police officer said, we can't take this piece of work we've done to the people in our offices, to the people who work in this police force, because it's not finished yet. We don't know all the answers. And you could see there this kind of mindset, which was, I'm a senior person, I'm a leader, I have to have the answers. I don't think that's very helpful, partly to go back to something we've already talked about, because if you want a plan, if you like, that can survive first contact with the enemy, the better plan it is that's going to help you, and it's likely to be a better plan if you've got the wisdom of the whole organisation involved. So I think part of what leadership needs to do is to create the environment in which people can get involved, people can contribute what they need to contribute, and to do that they need that safer space. So I think it's about creating an environment in which it's understood that there's, and probably explicitly discussed, having some ground rules in these discussions, I think, is a really helpful idea. So you have a very clear commitment to confidentiality in discussions, to things like listening. So if you say something that I don't agree with, I'm, say, the leader or whatever, I don't immediately knock you down. I listen and I take your point of view on board. If you're in one of those meetings and you think you feel that what you want to say is daft or won't be received well, no, you want people to feel that they can say anything, even if you're in, when you say it, you feel silly saying it or whatever. Anything should be sayable. And there also needs to be an absolute commitment that everything that is then demonstrated in practice, that everything that is said is heard. And I think leadership needs to take the lead on creating that environment. That's more important than them having the answers. In fact, it's better if they don't have all the answers, really, because you want something that's created by everybody. Then you've got more chance that you don't get all that resistance. And you've got a chance you've got something that's going to stand up better against, the challenge presented by real life when it goes. Having said that, nothing's going to completely manage to resist real life. So you need to be flexible. So it's not a good idea to have too many rigid outcomes in mind anyway. But just to go back to that safety thing, it's absolutely about creating an environment in which people have the permission and the reassurance, and indeed can feel a bit and be a bit emotional if they need to be. Because this is an emotional business. But going back to what I said about the system, people have got their lives tied up in this. Now, if we're talking about church, that is even more so.
Yeah.
Way more so.
Yeah.
I mean, people feel strongly and powerfully and emotionally enough about, the biscuit factory, right? So we're talking about stuff here that people have given their lives to, that represents their faith, that represents their deepest aspirations and their deepest sense of what's right. So helping them to think through that and to contribute to the development of the way that's going to be lived out, that's vital.
So it's more like the conductor of an orchestra rather than the pilot of a plane.
Yeah, I think so. It is more. I think it is more like that. I mean, sometimes leaders. I don't mean that leaders don't have good ideas, and doesn't mean that they don't contribute. But I think it is more about saying, look, we know we've got an issue here, or does anybody think it's all right? Depending on what it is, I mean, in the UK, we've got a lot of churches where there's been a real slide in numbers, where there's a real concern about influence, and it's kind of fairly obvious that there are issues, problems. So maybe you don't have to work too hard to point that out. But I think what there is more in the UK is there is a lot of anxiety and pessimism about the extent to which you can do anything about it.
Yes.
Now, in the end, that is in the hands of God. And I go back to my point that we need to be praying as much as we need to be having, management-type discussions or whatever. And in fact, we should be doing the two things at the same time, maybe, or certainly in the same meeting. But I think what leaders can do is help people just to see and create an environment in which people can start to see new potential, new possibilities, to take steps forward. But they don't need to be the ones who keep coming up with the ideas.
Great, thank you. Last question. What about the theology of the 9 principles and practices?
The theology of the 9 principles and practices. I think I come back to a conviction that the kind of things that we need to do as church are not so very different from what we need to do as organisation more generally. In fact, they're only reinforced, I think. So I think if we look at the questions we've been discussing theologically, the issue is, what is God calling us to? What does God want from us? What is God saying to us in this situation? Can we hear the voice of the Spirit? What's the process of discernment? That's the kind of language we would be using, and I think we'd be saying things like, what does it mean to serve God, say in this location, now as against in the past, or what's the thing that lies ahead of us? No, I don't think that's very different from what you'd ask in an organisation. I think in an organisation of any other kind, you would be asking, what do we need to do in order to continue to flourish in the light of a whole set of new circumstances, but in a way that preserves our essential identity? It's about the fact that we have a real shared identity here. I guess what you're adding to it in the church is this very deliberate sense, this very conscious sense that, it's not just about what we decide. It's about what God is calling us to.